Hey there everybody, today we're going to paint a beautiful bouquet in a bottle by Willow Wolfe. This is from Naya's Pretty Pots Watercolor Workbook. Today she's using an Amavi size 4 and 6 round, as well as Sap Green, Alizarin Crimson, Cad Red Pale, and Burnt Umber. And she'll be making mixtures with these colors. Naya will begin with her Sap Green. And we're going to just water it down a little bit and mix it with some Payne's Gray to create a beautiful dusky green tone. The more water she adds, the more transparent it is. We don't want it too transparent, but we want to create a nice wash. You'll also notice that Naya taps her brush off on paper towel to make sure that she's getting the excess paint off the brush. Beginning in the shadow area, using the number 4 round or number 6 round, the color is applied. Then she rinses the brush, blots on paper towel, and begins to work that color outward. So she's blending it into the surface as she goes. The more you rinse the brush and blot, the less color you have in it, the more transparent it is, and the easier it will be to blend into a gradient of the background showing. So continue to rinse, blot, and work that color from the edges in toward the center. Each time you rinse the brush and blot, you're going to get lighter and lighter and lighter, and work around the label, creating a beautiful highlight towards the middle right side. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to that sap green and just apply it near the bottom of the bottle for a nice tint. And it's going at the bottom and kind of around where that bottle pops up into the middle, just to create a little bit of shadow in that area. Rinse the brush, blot, and continue to work the color in. And you'll get a beautiful gradient from dark green to nothing, which allows you to see a gorgeous highlight. While the bottle is still wet, you can add a little bit of more green on the left side and work it in. She's using a technique called stacking, where she applies the green color to the left on top of the previous green layer, but we don't want to put so much color on that we cover up that first layer entirely. Using a technique called airplaning, which is where when you apply the color, you actually kind of lift and drag it off the surface. So when you're applying the stems into these background areas, you're applying the stem and dragging it over the surface a little bit. And then she's just taking a bit more of that green and shading the bottom of the bottle and underneath the label. You can do quite a bit wet on wet. You don't necessarily have to let every layer dry, but you got to kind of feel it out as you go, because if it starts to get dry, you don't want to necessarily lift all the layers underneath. Working with a little bit of burnt umber with water mixed in to ensure it creates a transparent wash, we're going to begin the label. So adding that color on the outer edge, rinsing and blotting right away to begin to immediately work that color in towards the center. That's going to give the edges of the label a nice crisp edge, and then it's going to turn into a wash, a more transparent wash into the center area, giving you a little bit of that aged look. Often when Naya's blending, she's rouging, meaning that she's moving the brush in a slightly circular motion in order to create a more natural effect, and it helps to blend it into the background. We're back to our sap green. We're going to apply a little bit at the top or the upper neck of that bottle. It's a little bit less transparent, just to create kind of that edge, and then leaving some white space for highlight to start and kind of get a feel for where we want to land. And mixing a little bit of Payne's Gray into that green. We're going to begin the stems of the flowers. Payne's Gray has a lot of blue in it. So what we're getting here is a beautiful, rich, dusky blue-green, because it is a gray, which is a very natural, pretty look on the bottle. And just kind of blocking in or filling in the leaves and the stems. Beautiful transition between the bottle to the leaves because they're a similar color. And it's not too transparent, so we haven't put too much water in the mix here. It's just enough to make it a little bit transparent, but also to have nice, dark, rich leaves. The less water you put, the darker your leaves will be. And it's nice to kind of play around with the darkness and the lightness of the leaves so that some are darker than others and you have a little bit of variation in the leaf areas themselves. We're just continuing, and sometimes we imagine the darker leaves are behind, covered up by the lighter leaves. Sometimes we flip it and go the other way. The beauty of these projects in the workbooks is that you're able to kind of play around and get used to changing the value scale of each element that you're painting. So it really is your project. You can do what you want with it. With the watercolor workbooks, they're really easy to kind of rotate and turn around on your surface. I always find it easier to pull a stroke towards myself in order to kind of lift off the surface and get a fine point. So it's good to be able to maneuver, manipulate your surface. These workbooks are about 6.25 by 9 inches in height. So they're nice tabletop surfaces to work on, and you can still leave them open and turn them around as you go. So that you can get just the right angle for yourself. Some artists push the brush away from themselves and finish with a point. There's no right or wrong. Both ways work beautifully, and you'll be able to get a really beautiful finish either way you work it. Once the first layer is complete, you want to let it dry for a little bit and go back and apply another layer. That will make sure that the paint does not move underneath the brush too much from that first layer, and it will ensure that your layer of shadow that's being applied here is nice and rich in comparison. Again, when you're layering, you're stacking color on, which means that you're applying a darker layer of color, in this case the stem, and additional shadows, ensuring that we don't cover the preceding layer. She's using a technique called airplaning in many cases, where you drag the brush like a stroke and lift as you're releasing the brush to make sure that the end of the stroke is narrower and thinner than the top where she's begun. That also helps ensure it's darker at the beginning of the stroke and lighter at the end. Airplaning is an important technique for florals and many other objects and practices that you're painting. The more layers you add, the more depth and dimension an object will have. So as you continue to add deeper and darker layers and shadows, you're going to get more depth and more dimension in each individual element that you're painting. And one thing that Naya loves to do is kind of add these messy bits in the middle, these little pieces of what some might consider to be imperfections that actually bring the painting a lot of personality. So in this case, she's taking a little bit of that burnt umber or sap green and adding little splotches of color on the label to make it look aged, and in the glass to give it a little bit of additional dimension. Let the painting fully dry. Sometimes I leave it for 20 minutes, sometimes I leave it for half an hour to an hour. That's going to make sure that the layers underneath are completely dry and ready to go for the next step. What you don't want to have happen is the greens and the reds run into each other, merge, and create a murky brown tone. So you really want to let this painting dry for a little while before you continue on with the additional colors that will be used. As you're reading along in the instructions are point form. They're to give you a guide and an idea of what colors to use. You're welcome to play around with different colors. We're using that Cad Red Pale here, or Cad Red Light, whichever one you have, and just beginning this first layer on the florals. And it's a very rich, warm tone, leaving a little bit of white space for highlight and essentially filling in the petal for the remainder of the section that she's painting. The Cad Reds or Pyrrole Reds are two different names for very similar colors, have a very warm tone. They're almost leaning towards the orange family. So that's going to give you really bright pop of color in a complementary color scheme like this one here. So the red really stands out with the green beside it. And just using little strokes, you can kind of block in that area, leave a little bit of white for a highlight. Don't worry about light sources or where the highlight should be. The beauty of flowers is that even if there is a light source, because petals overlap one another because of their positioning, sometimes the highlights are in different places than you'd expect. So I always encourage people not to get too hung up on the exact placement of something. Really just kind of work on form, shape, dimension, and layers of color from transparent to darker. And of course, again, the more color you have in your brush and the less water, the more opaque it will be. And sometimes it's nice to have darker, more opaque color at the back of the petals and a little bit lighter, more transparent color in the front of the petals. That's going to give you kind of an automatic shadow and highlight that's really, really beautiful. Leaving a little bit open in the middle there for the centers, and taking a look at the overall composition and design and taking a little pause, and then building with some alizarin crimson. Alizarin crimson's a little bit of a cooler red. It's a really beautiful, beautiful tone. I'm just taking a bit of that crimson and applying it to the petal. It's going to be a really rich, gorgeous, deep red. The back petals, sometimes we might lean towards filling them in almost completely and leaving very little white space or no white space at all. And then the front petals, you might want to leave a little bit of white space just to make sure you have some variety. You'll notice how often Naya taps the brush off. Tapping the brush on paper towel is a really great way to control how much color gets applied to the surface. If we just dip in water and grab color, you have the risk of water dumping onto the surface or having extremely transparent color, which is much more difficult to control. Tapping that brush off on paper towel allows you to have more control over the amount of color that gets applied to the surface. And quite often we add deeper, rich tones at the base of the flowers and a little bit lighter at the top. And as we're working this color in, you could do these two ways. One, you could apply a transparent, warmer red tone in the background of most of the petal, leaving just a little bit of white space, and then layering the alizarin crimson once it's dry over top. Or you can play around with a little bit of wet on wet or mixing the two together. The goal is to make sure you have more than one value. So you don't want to just have a straight warm red or cool red petal. You want to have a little bit of warmth, highlight, and shadow in every single flower. So making sure you have some warm red towards the tips and some deeper, cooler red towards the bottom gives you really beautiful depth and dimension. That's absolutely gorgeous. And one of the most beautiful things about watercolor is our ability to reshape things. A lot of people think that when you apply watercolor to a surface, that's it, it's done. But that's not necessarily the case. You have the ability to add additional depth, to add white acrylic highlights, to reshape entire pieces of the composition to give you the structure that you're looking for. So I always recommend to people to kind of take a pause, stop, slow down, take a look at the finished one that you're working on, take another look at your instructions, and let things kind of sit and dry so that you can give yourself just a moment to digest where you're at in the value scales and decide what you want to do next as your next steps. When we're looking at a project like this, each crisp color is going to give you lots and lots of richness and bold depth and dimension. And in the center of these flowers here, a little bit of that alizarin crimson plus Payne's gray is going to give you a really deep, rich, beautiful tone that stands out. And here, just taking a little bit of warm red, reshaping some things, redefining, making sure that we have the color in the center and the outer edges the way that we want. These flowers could have been any color you'd like, and the bottle could have been a beautiful deep red tone with greens and then red flowers. So I really encourage you to play around and just kind of enjoy the process. Take a look once you kind of have a majority of the elements on, see if anything else needs to be deepened or lightened to give you lots of vibrance. Let it dry overnight and continue to play with it tomorrow. One thing we recommend is that you don't close the book up for at least a couple of hours. Leave the painting a few hours to dry in case any little thicker bits of watercolor have sat there and aren't completely fully dried yet. Because sometimes it may look dry or feel dry to the touch, but isn't dry all the way through the layers and isn't cured, and it will smudge on the other side. So we're just taking a little bit of that alizarin crimson and Payne's gray and making sure that we've added some depth at the top of the other two flowers, just to show that things are in the background far back and that we have a really rich inner center. And you can continue to play. We have a whole series of watercolor workbooks out there, and this one by Willow Wolfe is called Pretty Pots, and it's a beautiful, beautiful selection of different types of flower pots, all the way from wine bottles to boots and purses with beautiful florals filling them. Thank you, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and we will see you at the next one.